I am Abin Enam, 30C English, Pino College, Pino. The Indian Constitution, limited but necessary. Professor Gopinath Ravindran. The Constitution of India provides the basic legal foundation that clearly sets forth the general objectives of the Indian state, its commitment to certain basic values, and the relations between the people and the state and its various institutions. Unlike the constitutions of many other nations, the Indian Constitution was drafted over a period of nearly 3 years by a constituent assembly of elected representatives from provincial legislatures who finally produced the longest written constitution in the world with 26 parts at present, running into about 1,45,000 words. The Indian constitution, unlike the constitutions of many other countries, invokes the people of India as the source of the constitution, unmediated by any god or religion. The 389 members of the Constituent Assembly were drawn from representatives of provincial legislature selected in 1946 on the basis of partial franchise and representatives of princely states and chief commissioner territories. While the Indian Constitution sets out the underlying principles and commitments of the nation, it recognizes that changes will become necessary in the future and thus includes the provision to make changes or amendments through special procedures that are more difficult than normal legislative processes. However, in a landmark judgment in 1973, in the Keshavananda Bharati versus State of Kerala case, the Supreme Court ruled that the basic structure of the Indian Constitution cannot be amended by the legislature. In 1976, the preamble to the Constitution was amended by inserting the words socialist and secular as part of the 42nd Amendment. This has continued without challenge by any political party, whereas those sections of the 42nd Amendment that strengthened the executive at the cost of the judiciary were found unconstitutional and repealed. With 106 amendments till date, we see that the Indian Constitution is a living constitution that can be modified as long as its basic structure is not changed. Since the adoption of the Constitution of India on 26 January 1950, the country has changed considerably its economic orientation, caste and class configurations, and the relative importance of various political formations. The Constitution has so far been able to withstand pressures and corrected attempts to aggrandize power by the legislature when a democratically elected party has overwhelming numerical dominance in the House of Parliament and state assemblies. Such pressures from competing political parties have not abated, and the citizenry of the country have to be ever vigilant to keep the basic structure of the Constitution safe from being emasculated. This brings us to the question of the basic structure of the Constitution and what makes it worthy of protection. The Indian Constitution was framed soon after the country won independence, after having successfully waged a long and difficult anti-imperialist struggle for nearly a century. In the course of the anti-imperialist struggle waged by different sections of Indians, those representing the ancient regime were quickly defeated and went on to collaborate with the colonial masters. The same was the story with modern political groupings that were organized on the basis of religious communities with the objective of attaining nationhood based on religion. They too, like the feudals, stayed away from confronting the colonial state. The long drawn-out struggle against the British in India was essentially led by a broad coalition of liberals and leftists who wanted an independent India that was democratic, culturally plural, and committed to the removal of age-old social and economic inequalities that prevented large sections of our population from taking advantage of the possibilities afforded by an independent, modern, democratic Indian state. While the liberals emphasized modern political freedoms passionately, they stopped short of advocating constitutional rights to effect radical social redistribution of wealth and property. The Constitution may thus be seen as the legal embodiment of the values, aspirations, and anxieties of Indian nationalist leaders during the last decades of colonial rule in India. The Congress party, which presided over the end of colonial rule, was faced with the tremendous task of keeping an entire subcontinent with the greatest of diversities together. The fears of the propertied classes had to be allayed. The capitalists had to be accommodated as significant partners in the new Indian state. Appalling economic backwardness, poverty, and caste oppression had to be addressed by giving people hope for a better future, and religious political mobilizations had to be kept in check. All these stupendously difficult tasks had to be undertaken while preventing an outright revolutionary transformation that would have not limited itself to political rearrangements but would have dismantled the underlying unequal distribution of wealth and property as well. It must be clarified that the demand for responsible government went back to the beginning of the 20th century, with limited piecemeal concessions being handed out by the colonial state. Indians rejected the Simon Commissions, and the Congress set up the Motilal Nehru Committee in 1928 to determine the principles of the Constitution of India. The majority of Nehru's committee's recommendations found their way into the Indian Constitution. Following the civil disobedience movement and the demand for a constitution prepared by an elected constituent assembly was repeatedly put forth by Congress. Finally, in 1942, the Cripps India Mission clearly spelled out that the framing of a constitution for India would be substantially carried out by Indians. With the end of the war and the coming of Labour Party to office in Britain and the appointment of the Cabinet Mission, the Constituent Assembly came into being in 1946. Written in such a historical context, the Constitution worked fairly well despite the Muslim League representatives leaving the Constituent Assembly and the creation of Pakistan based on religion. According to Jawaharlal Nehru, the Constituent Assembly is a nation on the move, throwing away the shell of its past political and possibly social structure and fashioning for itself a new garment of its own making. The essential features of this new garment were borrowed eclectically from the existing constitution of a wide range of nation-states as well as from earlier Indian drafts and colonial acts. The basic structure of the constitution as spelled out in the Keshavananda Bharati case refers inter alia to the primacy of the constitution over all other laws. The prescription of a sovereign, secular, democratic and republican government for India committed to building a welfare state based on the directive principles with federal features. While maintaining the unity of the country, this non-negotiable basic structure has served well so far in thwarting attempts to introduce legislation and amendments that seek to restrict individual rights and freedoms. It has, in short, kept a check on the Indian state at different moments in its recent history, when it has tried to go against the basic principles underlying the idea of independent India. The Constitution plays a major role in different kinds of state systems, where the state rules in the name of individuals and people. In the case of democratic India, with its religiously and culturally plural population and a history of communal strife that tragically resulted in the partition of the country, special care has to be taken to safeguard religious minorities from being alienated from the majority. Similarly, territories that varied greatly in terms of polity and development were integrated into the Indian Union. The Constitution, through various thoughtful provisions, for instance, the 5th and the 6th schedules, has attempted to protect vulnerable areas and their populations. While the Constitution of India has largely been able to withstand till now attempts to dilute the organizing principles of secularism and political democracy, its success in ensuring redistributive justice to the millions of desperately poor Indians has been extremely limited. As Dr. Ambedkar insightfully commented, parliamentary democracy developed a passion for liberty. It failed to realize the significance of equality and did not even endeavor to strike a balance between liberty and equality, with the result that liberty swallowed equality and has made democracy a name and a farce. To conclude, in India today, the Constitution, despite its failing to ensure redistributive justice, has to be safeguarded as it has successfully till now protected democratic rights and the secular nature of Indian polity. Democracy and secularism by themselves will not alleviate poverty or reduce inequality, but then these are necessary though not sufficient conditions of redistributive justice. Therefore, while continuing to be vigilant against any fresh attempt at changing the basic structure of the Constitution, the struggle to make the Indian state take its constitutional duty to the directive principles and welfare seriously should not stop in the name of religion, nationalism or economic efficiency. About the writer and the essay. Professor Gopinath Ravindran is a distinguished scholar in history and the present Vice Chancellor of Kannur University. He began his teaching career at St. Stephen's, New Delhi, and after a short period joined the Department of History and Culture, Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi. His research degrees are from the Center for Historical Research, JNU. For postdoctoral, he attended the Department of Social Policy, London School of Economics. His book, Historical Demography and Agrarian Regimes, addresses the demographic changes in southern India from 1881 to 1981. Reviews observe that the work is situated at the interface of history and demography and recommend it as an invaluable reference book for students and scholars of history, demography and population studies. Another landmark contribution is his critical study on William Logan that demonstrates his long-time critical engagement with Malabar and its economic and cultural history. The study is titled William Logan, the Historiographic Significance of a Scholar Administrator, and it forms a part of the new edition of the monumental Malabar Manual with commentaries in 2 volumes. Gopinath Ravindran's glorious exit from the ICHR as member secretary before the completion of the tenure highlights the vital role of academics and public intellectuals as voices of dissent and protest against the continuing offensive on democratic and secular traditions and premier national institutions. Professor Gopinath Ravindran's essay is remarkable for its lucidity and the right kind of polemics. It situates the writing of Indian Constitution in context and goes on to discuss its significance and limitations. The author suggests that amendments without sacrificing the basic structure are necessary for furthering inclusiveness and equity. The observation regarding the failure of the Constitution to ensure redistributive justice is a felt reality, and so is the need to safeguard it despite its failing. The article advances and the argument that the struggle to make the Indian state takes its constitutional duty to the directive principles and welfare seriously must continue and should not be allowed to stop in the name of religion, nationalism, or economic efficiency. Glossary. The general objectives of the Indian state are spelled out clearly in the objective resolution presented by Jawaharlal Nehru on 13th December 1946 and unanimously adopted and approved by the Constituent Assembly on January 22nd, 1947. It forms the underlying principles of the Constitution of India. The objective resolution set forth that India was to be an independent and sovereign republic. There would be a democratic union with equal level of self-government in all constituent parts. All power and authority of government was vested in the people. The Constitution must strive to guarantee the people justice based on equality, social, political and economic, equality before law and equality of opportunity, freedom of thought, expression, belief, faith and worship, subject to law and public morality, just right for minorities, depressed classes and backward areas so as to ensure justice. The Constitution was framed to secure for India a due place in the community of nations and to contribute to the promotion of world peace and the welfare of mankind. Kesavanand Bharati vs. State of Kerala case is often described as a case that saved Indian democracy. Justice Hans Raj Khanna observed that the Constitution possesses a basic structure of constitutional values and principles. He outlined the basic structure doctrine and asserted that those amendments which tend to affect the basic structure of the Constitution are subject to judicial review. Any constitutional amendment seeking to implement the directive principles which does not affect the basic structure shall not be subjected to judicial review. In short, the basic structure doctrine entitles the Indian judiciary to review and strike down amendments to the Constitution of India passed by the Indian Parliament if it is in conflict with or seek to alter the basic structure of the Constitution. 42nd Amendment is the 1976 controversial amendment of the preamble of the Constitution, which inserted the words socialist and secular. The addition of certain articles and sections to the Constitution as part of this was found to curtail the democratic rights and also strip the Supreme Court of some powers. It was generally understood as an undemocratic turn towards parliamentary sovereignty and the concentration of power on the Prime Minister. Aggrandize power, acquire more authority. Numerical dominance, majority in terms of number in the two houses. Cripps India Mission, failed mission led by Sir Stafford Cripps to secure the full support of India in the Second World War. Labour Party. The Labour Party came to power in 1945 in a landslide victory, and Clement Attlee became the Prime Minister in the crucial period when India gained freedom. The Constituent Assembly is a nation on making. Nehru, who was influenced both by the liberal democratic traditions of the 19th century and the Fabian socialism of the early 20th century, argues for an India politically and socially reconstituted. Directive principles of state policy aim to establish social and economic democracy through a welfare state. The 5th and the 6th schedules, passed by Constituent Assembly between September 5 to 7, 1949. These schedules recommend special governance mechanisms for certain scheduled areas to preserve the diversity of marginal subcultures. Redistributive justice, equal distribution of wealth and property, measures to ensure social and economic justice. Answer in 2 or 3 sentences. In what respect is Indian Constitution unlike constitutions of other countries? Second question. Is Indian Constitution a document that should not be amended at all? What should be the ground for amendments? Third question. Which amendment of the last century was the most controversial one? What was the context of the amendment? Fourth question. What is the basic structure doctrine? Fifth question. What was the role of those who represented ancient regimes in the freedom struggle? Sixth question. Which section of people, according to the author, actually led to the freedom struggle of India and with what consequence? Seventh question. How does the author describe Indian freedom struggle? Eighth question. Comment on the insertion of the words socialist and secular as part of the 42nd Amendment. Ninth question. Does the coming of the Labour Party help the cause of Indian independence? How? Answer in 80 to 100 words. First question. Indian Constitution was drafted by representatives selected on the basis of partial franchise. Does this cause any issue at that time? Would it have been different if done by representatives selected on the basis of universal adult franchise? Attempt an answer reading about the debates of the time. Respond to the statement. The Indian Constitution, unlike the constitutions of many other countries, invokes the people of India as the source of the Constitution, unmediated by any god or religion. Third question. Read about Kesavananda Bharati versus State of Kerala case and respond to the observation that this case saved Indian democracy. Fourth question. Discuss the significance of the basic structure doctrine in the context of India. Fifth question. Respond to the statement that the citizenry of the country have to be ever vigilant to keep the basic structure of the constitution safe from being emasculated. What might be the source and the context of the anxiety of the author? Sixth question. Find out the histories of political groupings that were organized on the basis of religious communities with the objective of attaining nationhood based on religion. Seventh question. Write a short note on the stupendously difficult tasks the national governments of India had undertaken hitherto. Eighth question. Respond to this position in the light of Ambedkar's attitude in the concluding speech. The governments of India had to be vigilant about preventing an outright revolutionary transformation that would not have limited itself to political rearrangements but would have dismantled the underlying unequal distribution of wealth and property as well. Ninth question. The author refers to fresh attempts at changing the basic structure of the constitution. Read and give in writing a short account of such attempts and the would-be consequences. Answer in 200 to 250 words. First question. Discuss the relevance of Gopinath Ravindran's observations on the Indian constitution and its features in the context of the challenges to Indian democracy and secularism. Second question. Professor Gopinath Ravindran views the Indian constitution as a fundamental document which must be safeguarded and at the same time renewed through amendments to ensure political, social and economic equity through democratic means. Elucidate. Read, relate and write. First question. Professor Gopinath Ravindran draws attention to the religious plurality and cultural diversity of democratic India and a history of communal strife and underscores the need to safeguard religious minorities from being alienated from the majority. Taking the examples of nation states driven by aggressive religions, discuss whether the democratic polity can survive religious nationalism. Second question. Is there a nearly total regression in political, social and cultural life of India? Is it a striking departure from ideals of democracy and secularism? Respond with instances of violation of human and individual rights and indifference to egalitarian values in the last 2 decades. Third question. Refer to major amendment of the Indian Constitution and mention how those amendments function to fulfill the directive principles. Fourth question. Study the reference to the defeat of the representatives of ancient regime. This may be a reference to some sections of Indians who waged what was described by historians as the last kick of feudal India at British 1857 war. Language matters. The Constituent Assembly is a nation on the move, throwing away the shell of its past political and possibly social structure and fashioning for itself a new government of its own making. This sentence spoken by Nehru employs a metaphor introduced through 2 words. Does it suggest a kind of conservative tradition slowing? Write a note on the metaphor and how it informs an attitude to the past tradition and the present modernity of India. Second question. Read the essay carefully, focusing on the literary and see how the literary creeps into the formal language of social sciences. Write down such metaphors and note the ideological implications. Is it possible to use language without such slippages into the literary as seen in questions 1 of this section? About this chapter? Thank you.